Electrical activity of the heart can be represented by an electrical dipole called cardiac vector. Direction and magnitude of the dipole characterizes the current state of heart along the cardiac cycle. As we know, SA node is the primary pacemaker of the heart. When these generates an action potential, the wave of depolarization will stimulate the neighboring cell through the gap junctions that we have discussed in detail in previous video, and this flow of depolarization wave can be represented by an arrow or a vector. So this wave of depolarization is spreading from SA node to all over the atria as a downward and leftward. So if we add all these small vectors and make a net atrial vector or the dominant vector, it would be like this. The vector which is produced due to depolarization of the atrium is the first cardiac vector. Once both the atrium has been completely depolarized, then the wave of depolarization will hit the annuli fibrosi cordis or the cardiac skeleton. So this fibrous skeleton of the heart is an highly density single structure connective tissue that forms and anchors the valves and influences the forces exerted by and through them. And this is the structural representation of this. So most of the depolarizing current is neutralized by hitting this fibrous structure because it is not excitable and contractible and conductible cells like myocardiocyte. So the only way for a depolarizing current to reach the ventricles is through the AV node. Now the current through the AV node is delayed. Why is discussed in the previous video in detail. So the depolarizing current reaches the ventricles from the atria is only by AV node. So when this depolarizing current is moving through the AV node, it produces a very small vector because it's a tiny tissue, so that there is no significant vector has been produced. Now ventricular depolarization can be divided into two phases. First, depolarization of ventricular septum, and second, simultaneous depolarization of right and left ventricle. Now let's talk about septal depolarization. Now the depolarizing current from the AV node will move to his bundle and its branches. These bundle branch are the one which is going to depolarize this interventricular septum. Especially the left bundle branch will depolarize because the sub branches from the left bundle branch will supply the interventricular septum, but the right bundle branch doesn't stimulate the septum. Now the depolarization takes from downward and upward. So these sub-branches of left bundle branch will supply the interventricular septum, especially in the lower portion. So this septum is the first portion of a ventricle to depolarize, beginning on the left side and spreading to the right. So the net septal vector can be represented by rightward and upward. Now let's talk about the ventricular free wall and basal depolarization. Once the septum is completely stimulated, next the depolarization wave moves to the Purkinje system of both the ventricles, and this will stimulate the adjacent myocardial cells present in the free wall of ventricles and the base. Since the left ventricle is 3 times thicker than the right, so the depolarization vector produced by the left ventricle is much stronger than the right. So the net cardiac vector of the left ventricle would be leftward and downward. And this is the rough representation of ventricular vectors. V1 is oriented to right and posteriorly, reflecting the electrical predominance of septum, and V2 is oriented to left and posteriorly, reflecting the electrical predominance of left ventricle. So depolarization of the ventricles takes from inside to outside, that is from endocardium to epicardium. In the same way, repolarization takes from outside to inside, that is from epicardium to endocardium.